At 9:48 a.m. on June 20th, 2001, a chilling 911 call came into Houston dispatch. "I need a police officer," Andrea Yates said, her breath heaving unsteadily into the phone. "What's the problem?" the dispatcher asked. No answer. Nothing but Andrea breathing irregularly, as if an intruder might be holding a gun to her head. "Are you having a disturbance?" the dispatcher pressed. Still no answer. "Are you ill, or what?" Valuable seconds ticked by. What police found when they arrived at that quiet suburban Houston home would become one of the most shocking crimes in American history. 5 children, Noah 7, John 5, Paul 3, Luke 2, and baby Mary, just 6 months old, all dead. When officers asked Andrea Yates what happened, she looked them in the eye and said simply, "I killed my kids." But to understand how a loving mother could systematically drown her 5 children one by one in the family bathtub, we need to go back to the beginning. Welcome back to Anatomy of Evil channel, and today we're diving deep into one of the most complex and heartbreaking cases in criminal history. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell because we cover cases like this every week, always with respect for the victims and their families. Today's case involves Andrea Yates, a case that placed the legal definition of insanity under intense public scrutiny and sparked a national conversation about postpartum mental health. We'll explore the warning signs that were missed, the tragic events of June 20th, 2001, the controversial trials that followed, and the questions about mental health care that still remain unanswered today. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's about a woman who suffered from severe postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, and schizophrenia, and a system that failed both her and her children in the most devastating way possible. Before we begin, please know this episode contains discussions of child death, mental illness, and suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, 5 children woke up in their suburban Clear Lake home with no idea it would be their last day on Earth. Let me tell you about Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary Yates, not as victims of a crime, but as the vibrant, unique children they were. Noah is 7 years old, born February 26, 1994. He's the leader of the pack, the big brother who sets the tone for the family. Noah is intelligent, independent, and has an insatiable curiosity about the world around him. His passion? Bugs. Insects of every kind fascinate him. He collects them, studies them, and even hatches butterflies. His father describes him as someone who loves learning, and Noah soaks up knowledge like a sponge. Being the oldest, Noah carries a sense of responsibility. He's protective of his younger siblings, always watching out for them. When the family plays together, Noah often takes charge, organizing games and activities. He's gentle with the creatures he studies, but firm when he needs to be the responsible big brother. Noah is currently being homeschooled by his mother Andrea, and he's thriving academically. His intelligence shines through in everything he does. 5-year-old John, born December 15th, 1995, is pure energy and joy. His father remembers him as rough and tumble with a great smile, and that smile could light up any room. John loves physical play and isn't afraid to get dirty. He's the kind of kid who sees the world as his playground. His favorite colors are black and red, and he's passionate about heavy-duty equipment. Trucks fascinate him, especially the big diesel ones. John's first clear word was truck, which he pronounced as true. When he was a baby, everything round was a ball to him, tomatoes, oranges, anything circular. His older brother Noah would point to round objects in the grocery store just to hear John exclaim, "Ball," and then they'd both laugh. John plays t-ball and loves being part of a team. He has an infectious enthusiasm that draws people to him. His hobbies include roughhousing with his brothers and bouncing. He has a big red ball bouncer that he received for his 5th birthday, and he bounces all over the house on it. John looks up to his big brother Noah tremendously, trying to copy everything he does, including collecting bugs, though John is admittedly less gentle with them than Noah. 3-year-old Paul, born September 13, 1997, is what every parent dreams of, the most well-behaved of all the children. His father describes him with evident pride as the child who rarely causes trouble, the one who listens and follows rules. Paul is quiet but observant, taking in everything around him with curious eyes. Paul follows his older brothers everywhere, trying his best to keep up with their games and adventures. He's particularly close to Luke, who's just a year younger, and the two often play together while the older boys are busy with more complex activities. Paul has a gentle nature that complements the household dynamics perfectly. When John is being boisterous and Luke is pushing boundaries, Paul provides a calm presence. 2-year-old Luke, born February 15, 1999, is the family's little challenging spirit. His father affectionately calls him the troublemaker, the one most likely to challenge boundaries. Luke is curious about everything and isn't afraid to test limits to see what he can get away with. He's the child who keeps his parents on their toes. Despite being labeled the troublemaker, Luke's mischief comes from a place of pure childhood curiosity. He wants to explore, to touch, to understand how everything works. Luke is still very much a toddler, with all the wonder and boundary testing that comes with that age. He adores his older brothers and constantly tries to keep up with them, even though he's the second youngest. At just 6 months old, baby Mary is the princess of the family, as her father lovingly describes her. Born in November 2000, Mary is the miracle the family had been hoping for. After 4 boys, they finally have their little girl. Her father admits he never thought they'd have anything but boys, telling Andrea, "I thought boys were all we'd ever have. I told her I wanted a basketball team first, then we'd talk about girls." Mary is still an infant, completely dependent on her family for everything. She represents hope and new possibilities for the Yates family. She brings a different energy to the household, softer, gentler. Her brothers are protective of their baby sister, and she's already showing signs of having them wrapped around her tiny finger. The Yates family lives in a modest home in Clear Lake, a suburban neighborhood in Houston, Texas. Their father, Russell, works as a NASA engineer at the Johnson Space Center. The family is deeply religious, attending the Clear Lake Church of Christ regularly. Andrea homeschools the children, and their home doubles as a classroom. The house is filled with the sounds of childhood, laughter, play, the occasional sibling squabble. Outside there's a baby swing hanging from a tree where Mary enjoys the gentle motion. Toys are scattered in the yard, evidence of active, playing children. The family dog, normally free to roam, is part of their daily routine. These children live in a world where their mother reads them stories like Hope for the Flowers, about caterpillars and butterflies. They play games where their father holds them upside down and swings them while making cuckoo clock sounds. Noah asks for enough after 1 round, but John always says, "Do again." They go to the pool where John fearlessly jumps off the diving board over and over. The morning of June 20th, 2001, on this particular Wednesday morning, the routine begins like any other. Their father prepares for work at NASA, expecting to return home for lunch as usual. The children wake up to what should be a normal summer day. Noah might be planning to look for more bugs in the yard. John is probably excited about playing with his trucks. Paul is ready to follow along with whatever activities his big brothers have planned. Luke is prepared to test a few boundaries and explore his world, and baby Mary is simply content to be held, fed, and loved. None of them know that their mother has been struggling with severe mental illness. None of them understand the significance of the fact that she recently stopped taking her antipsychotic medication. They don't know that just weeks earlier, She had filled this same bathtub with the intention of drowning them, only to change her mind at the last moment. The children have no idea that their normal morning routine is about to be shattered in the most unimaginable way. The morning of June 20th, 2001 starts like any other Wednesday in the Clear Lake suburb of Houston. The temperature is already climbing toward the high 80s, and the oppressive Texas humidity hangs in the air like a blanket. But inside the modest brick home on Beachcomber Lane, a routine morning is about to become the stuff of nightmares. Rusty Yates gets up early for work, just as he has countless times before. As a computer engineer at NASA's Johnson Space Center, he has a 10:30 a.m. presentation about space vehicle instrumentation systems. The children wake up to what should be another ordinary summer day. Andrea sets out cereal bowls and milk for breakfast, but something is different about her movements. There's a nervousness, an urgency that her husband notices but doesn't fully understand. Rusty asks Andrea to get ointment for Paul's lip, which he hurt at the playground. Andrea hurriedly dabs on the gel. John asks his father if he can finally have his long-awaited turn going to work with him at NASA and playing games at Space Center Houston. But Rusty has that important space shuttle design meeting and isn't in the mood to take John along. He tells him to stay with Mommy. What no one realizes is that Andrea has been planning this for weeks. On May 3rd, 2001, she had filled this same bathtub in the middle of the day. She would later confess to police that she had planned to drown the children that day, but decided against it. Today is different. Today, she's found the resolve to follow through with what her diseased mind believes is an act of salvation. Dr. Mohammed Saeed had given explicit instructions. Andrea was never to be left alone with the children. She needed round-the-clock supervision due to her hallucinations and paranoia. But Rusty has been trying to help Andrea regain some independence. At a family gathering the weekend before, he announced his decision to leave Andrea home alone for an hour each morning and evening, believing it would help her not become totally dependent on him and his mother for her maternal responsibilities. Andrea's mother expressed shock when she heard of Rusty's plan, saying Andrea wasn't stable enough to care for the children. She noted that Andrea demonstrated she wasn't in her right mind when she nearly choked Mary by trying to feed her solid food. But Rusty has made his decision. His mother, Dora Yates, is scheduled to arrive an hour later to take over for Andrea. In the space of that hour, Andrea Yates will drown all 5 children. After Rusty leaves for work, Andrea sits at the kitchen table with the children. She's been eating corn pops out of the box. Rusty had given her a 300 milligram morning dose of the antidepressant Effexor, and the previous night, a 45 milligram dose of the antidepressant Remeron with a 15 milligram dissolvable Remeron Soltab booster. But the medication isn't working anymore. The voices in her head are louder than ever. Instead of clearing the cereal bowls from the dining table, Andrea draws a bath in the guest bathroom of her Clear Lake home. Within the next hour, she would methodically drown all 5 of her children. What happens next defies comprehension. Andrea starts with Paul, Luke, and John, then lays them in her bed. She then drowns Mary, whom she leaves floating in the tub. Noah comes in and asks what was wrong with Mary. He then runs, but Andrea soon catches and drowned him. She leaves him floating in the tub and lays Mary in John's arms in the bed. Officer David Knapp would later testify that he saw 2 sets of wet footprints on the tile living room floor, indicating one of the children had escaped the bathtub before she caught him again. The evidence tells a story of desperation. At least one child, likely Noah, had broken free and run through the house before being captured and dragged back to the bathroom. At 9:48 a.m. on Wednesday, June 20th, 2001, 8 minutes before she calls her husband, Andrea Yates dials 911. "I need a police officer," she says, her breath heaving unsteadily into the phone. "What's the problem?" Police telecommunicator Doreen Stubblefield asks. No answer. Nothing but Andrea breathing irregularly, as if an intruder might be holding a gun to her head. "Are you having a disturbance?" Stubblefield asks, thinking this might be a domestic problem. No answer. "Are you ill, or what?" Valuable seconds tick by. "Is someone burglarizing your house?" More time slips away. At length, Andrea once more asks for a police officer. 8 minutes later, she makes the call that will shatter Rusty's world forever. A little before 10 a.m., 9:56 to be exact, Rusty Yates's cell phone rings in the 6th-floor shuttle vehicle engineering office he shares with 3 other NASA employees. "You need to come home," Andrea says, in a firm, sober voice Rusty has heard only once before and dreaded. Not long after the birth of their 4th son, Luke, 2 years earlier, she'd had a sort of nervous breakdown. That time, she had asked Rusty to come home from work. Now she isn't asking him, she's telling him. Puzzled, he asks, "What's going on?" She just repeats her statement and then adds, "It's time. I did it." Not entirely sure what she means, but in light of her recent illness, he asks her to explain, and she says, "It's the children." Now a chill shoots through him. "Which one?" he asks. "All of them." Rusty Yates doesn't need to hear any more. He races through the lobby and out the front doors of NASA Building 1, dialing his mother on the way. He sprints across the employee parking lot to his SUV. Officer David Knapp is the first to arrive at the house. When he asks Andrea why she called 911, she says simply, "I just killed my kids." Her hair and clothes are dripping wet when she answers his knock at the door. Andrea sits on a blue love seat. Knapp sits beside her. He asks for her driver's license, which she gives him, and permission to use the telephone in the adjacent kitchen to call his supervisor. Andrea is expressionless but makes eye contact, answers questions, and follows officers' instructions, even reading and signing a consent to search form. But what officers see inside the house will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Officer Frank Stumpo, the second policeman to arrive, tells jurors he sees the bodies of 4 children on a bed. The body of the oldest Yates boy, 7-year-old Noah, is still in the bathtub. Crime scene footage later shown in court reveals toys in the yard and a baby swing hanging from a tree outside their suburban Houston home. Inside, the book-filled room where Andrea homeschooled the children, and the kitchen strewn with half-empty cereal bowls from that morning's breakfast. When police reach the modest brick home on Beachcomber Lane, they find Andrea drenched with bathwater, her flowery blouse and brown leather sandals soaking wet. She had turned on the bathroom faucet to fill the porcelain tub and moved aside the shaggy mat to give herself traction for kneeling on the floor. When Rusty arrives 15 minutes later, the police and ambulances are already at their Houston home on the corner of Beachcomber and Sea Lark in the Clear Lake area. Rusty is told he cannot go in, so he puts his forehead against a brick wall, trying to process the horrifying news, and waits. Houston Police Sergeant David Svan testifies that soon after arriving at the home, a man runs toward him in the yard shouting, "What did she do to my kids? What did she do to my kids?" Svan doesn't know at first that it's Rusty Yates, the children's father. But Rusty then identifies himself and says that his wife had called him at his job at NASA's Johnson Space Center, telling him to come home because she had hurt the kids. KPRC-2 retired reporter Phil Archer is the first reporter on the scene. Cops were crying. There was a lot of emotion there. They were the guys that had gone in that house and had to recover the bodies, Archer recalls. They brought Andrea out and her clothes were still wet, and her hair was still wet from the bathtub. And they brought her out, and she looked like a zombie. There was a sort of wildness in her eyes. The evidence paints a picture of methodical horror. Andrea had a scuffle in the family room, sliding around on wet tile below a poster that proclaimed the epithets of Christ. Savior, Shepherd, Bishop of Souls. The irony is as chilling as it is tragic. At 11 a.m., Officer Bob King and his partner, Officer Douglas Bacon, both homicide investigators, arrive at the crime scene to begin collecting evidence along with Sergeant Boyd Smith, who interviews Dora Yates outside. King takes one look at Andrea Yates and asks that her handcuffs be removed. He pulls a worn card from his pocket and reads Andrea her rights one at a time from the card verbatim. She gives him her yeses. When asked if she understands each right, Andrea nods her understanding. The investigation has only just begun, but the basic facts are undeniable. 5 innocent children are dead, and their mother has confessed to killing them all. Coming up after this, we'll reveal what investigators found that changed everything about how this case would be prosecuted, and why the legal battle was far from over. The search for answers in the Yates family tragedy was about to take a dark turn into the complex world of mental illness, failed medical care, and a justice system unprepared for the reality of severe postpartum psychosis. Within hours of the 911 call, what seemed like an open and shut case begins to reveal layers of complexity that will transform this from a simple murder investigation into one of the most controversial criminal cases in American legal history. Sergeant Eric Mell, a 12-year veteran homicide detective with the Houston Police Department, arrives at the scene and immediately takes control of the investigation. Mell never uses videotape to interview subjects. It's not his habit. But what he's about to uncover in Interview Room 6 of the Harris County Police Headquarters will become the foundation for one of the most chilling confessions ever recorded. At the crime scene, the initial evidence collection begins systematically. Officer Bob King and his partner, Officer Douglas Bacon, both homicide investigators, arrive at 11 a.m. to begin collecting evidence along with Sergeant Boyd Smith, who interviews Dora Yates outside. The scene they encounter tells a story that's both methodical and deeply disturbing. King searches the 3 bedrooms, while Bacon takes responsibility for the hall bathroom, where Noah's body still floats face down in the tub, and the rest of the house, including the family room, kitchen, and living room, that doubled as a homeschooling classroom. What they find paints a picture of a family that, until that morning, appeared completely normal. On the stackable drawers, in a corner of the master bedroom, King finds a post-it note referring to a doctor's appointment 2 days earlier on June 18th at 5:30 p.m., and the business card of Dr. Mohammed Saeed, board-certified in adult, child, adolescent, and addiction psychiatry, noting a future appointment on June 26, Tuesday, at 6 p.m. The only prescription drugs the officers find in the Yates home are the psychiatric medications in the kitchen cabinet prescribed by Dr. Saeed. Bacon calls Saeed's office immediately. He and the other detectives speculate about the mental status of Yates that day. Something like this, you just gotta wonder. King says, shaking his head. Other pictures show cereal bowls on the kitchen counter and table, boxes of toys near bunk beds in the boys' room, and a playpen in the master bedroom. The house appears exactly as that of a typical family, which makes the scene in the bathroom and master bedroom all the more horrifying by contrast. 3 hours and 35 minutes after Andrea Yates dialed 911, Sergeant Male sits across from her in Interview Room 6. Andrea looks across the table at the man who brought her the Diet Coke. Her eyes are dead black. If you could, just go ahead and name your children and give their ages, Sergeant Eric Male says as the audio tape whirs. Noah, 7 years old. John, 5 years old. Paul, 3 years old. Luke, 2 years old. Mary, 6 months old, Yates replies. She has no attorney. There's a readiness in her answers that doesn't match the lethargy of her speech. As investigators dig deeper into Andrea Yates' background, what begins as a straightforward murder case suddenly transforms into something far more complex and disturbing. The breakthrough comes not from physical evidence, but from a disturbing pattern of mental illness that had been building for years, and a web of religious extremism that may have pushed an already fragile mind over the edge. The first major revelation comes when investigators examine Andrea's medical records and discover a shocking timeline of severe mental illness that had been escalating for 2 years. Dr. Eileen Starbranch, Andrea's first psychiatrist, provides testimony that stops investigators in their tracks. In July 1999, following the birth of her 4th child, Luke, Andrea had suffered a complete nervous breakdown that culminated in 2 suicide attempts and 2 psychiatric hospitalizations that summer. She was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis, a rare and dangerous condition that affects only 1 or 2 women per 1,000 births. Dr. Starbranch had given the Yates family explicit warnings that would prove prophetic. She testified that she urged Andrea and Rusty not to have any more children, telling them it would guarantee future psychotic depression. But the couple wanted as many babies as nature would allow, and they conceived their 5th child, Mary, just 7 weeks after Andrea's discharge from psychiatric care. Investigators discover that Andrea had been displaying alarming symptoms for months before the killings. After the death of her father on March 12, 2001, her condition deteriorated rapidly. She stopped taking her medication, mutilated herself, read the Bible feverishly, and stopped feeding baby Mary. She became so incapacitated that she required immediate hospitalization. On April 1, 2001, Andrea came under the care of Dr. Mohammed Saeed. She was treated with antipsychotic medication and released. But on May 3, 2001, just weeks before the murders, Andrea had filled the family bathtub in the middle of the day. She would later confess to police that she had planned to drown the children that day, but decided against it. Dr. Saeed was so concerned about her condition that he gave Rusty explicit instructions. Andrea was never to be left alone with the children. She needed round-the-clock supervision due to her hallucinations and paranoia. Here investigators uncover what may be the most crucial piece of the puzzle. Despite the doctor's warnings, Rusty had announced at a family gathering the weekend before the drownings that he had decided to leave Andrea home alone for an hour each morning and evening. He believed this would help her not become totally dependent on him and his mother for her maternal responsibilities. Andrea's family was horrified. Her brother, Brian Kennedy, later claims during a CNN Larry King Live broadcast that Rusty had expressed to him while transporting Andrea to a mental treatment facility that all depressed people needed was a swift kick in the pants to get them motivated. Andrea's mother, Yuta Kennedy, expressed shock when she heard of Rusty's plan, saying Andrea wasn't stable enough to care for the children. She noted that Andrea had demonstrated she wasn't in her right mind when she nearly choked baby Mary by trying to feed her solid food. As investigators probe deeper, they uncover a disturbing religious influence that may have shaped Andrea's delusions. The Yates family had been following the teachings of Michael Woroniecki, a traveling evangelical preacher who advocated extreme fundamentalist beliefs. Woroniecki's rhetoric was of the fire and brimstone variety. His proclamations included statements like, "Hell is right on the doorstep, waiting to bring you in." He preached that parents were especially responsible for ensuring the salvation of their children, lest they perish in hellfire. Most disturbing of all, he taught that parents ought to commit suicide rather than cause their children to stumble and go to hell. The similarities between the Woroniecki and Yates families were striking. Both families had children with biblical names, homeschooled their children, and lived in converted buses at one point. The Yates family had actually bought their bus from the Woroniecki's. Andrea had been corresponding with Michael and Rachel Woroniecki for years, exchanging letters and receiving spiritual guidance. Rachel Woroniecki had written to Andrea, "Life is so short. It is so very cruel. It is so lonely and empty. You must accept the reality that this life is under the curse of sin and death. Michael Woroniecki had described working women as witches and maintained that women were created to be helpmates to men, with their role derived from the sin of Eve at the creation of the world. When investigators interview Andrea in jail, the full scope of her psychotic state becomes clear. She tells them that she had been considering killing the children for 2 years. She believed she had not been a good mother to them and that they were not developing correctly. Most chillingly, she claimed to have been marked by Satan and that the only way to save her children from hell was to kill them. Then, when the state punished her for their deaths, Satan himself would be destroyed. The delusions were extensive and detailed. Andrea told investigators that television cartoon characters were telling her she was a bad mother. She heard a human voice that told her to get a knife. On the walls of the jail, she saw satanic teddy bears and ducks. Despite all this, she insisted she was not mentally ill and had never been depressed because she had never cried. Investigation into Andrea's medical care reveals a series of failures that may have contributed to the tragedy. In the weeks before the murders, Dr. Saeed had made a crucial decision that would prove fatal. On June 4, 2001, just 16 days before the killings, he discontinued Andrea's prescription for Haldol, the antipsychotic medication that had successfully treated her during her 1999 breakdown. Rusty later claimed that despite his urging to check Andrea's medical records for prior treatment, Dr. Saeed had refused to continue her regimen of Haldol, the treatment that had worked for her during her first breakdown. He reluctantly prescribed Haldol temporarily, but after a few weeks, he took her off the drug, citing concerns about side effects. According to authors Susie Spencer and Suzanne O'Malley, who investigated the case in detail, it was during a phone call Dr. Saeed made to Rusty during the breaking news of the killings that Saeed first learned that Andrea was not being supervised full-time as he had instructed. Investigators also discover that Andrea's treatment had been severely limited by insurance restrictions. During her hospitalizations, she had been discharged prematurely due to the 10-day psychiatric hospitalization insurance constraints of their provider, Blue Cross Blue Shield, subcontracted by Magellan Health Services. Rusty testified that his wife was too sick to be discharged from her last stay in the hospital in May 2001. He said he noticed the hospital staff lower their heads as if in shame and embarrassment, turning away without saying a word. But the hospital had no other choice due to the insurance limitations. As investigators piece together the timeline, a clear pattern emerges. Andrea's mental illness had been escalating for years, with multiple warning signs that were either ignored or inadequately treated. What investigators now understand is that Andrea Yates is not a typical criminal suspect. She is a 37-year-old former registered nurse who worked at the prestigious MD Anderson Cancer Center for 8 years. She has no criminal history, no history of violence against others, and by all accounts, had been a loving, devoted mother before her mental illness took hold. Born Andrea Kennedy on July 2, 1964, she grew up in a devout Catholic family and was described as shy, intelligent, and academically successful. She married Russell Yates in 1993, and they shared strong religious beliefs and a desire for a large family. But investigators now see that Andrea had been battling severe mental illness that was exacerbated by multiple factors: postpartum hormonal changes, religious extremism, social isolation, the stress of homeschooling and caring for 5 young children, and inadequate medical treatment. As news of Andrea's psychiatric history and the religious connections leak out, the case explodes into national headlines. The story has everything the media loves: a suburban mother, innocent children, religious extremism, and questions about mental health and the justice system. Television networks begin flashing images of Michael Woroniecki, sometimes showing him in a devil costume he wore while preaching, linking him to Andrea's confession that she killed her children to save their souls. The case becomes a lightning rod for discussions about postpartum depression, religious fundamentalism, and the treatment of mental illness in the criminal justice system. The revelations completely transform the prosecution's approach to the case. What had seemed like an open and shut murder case now involves complex questions of mental competency and criminal responsibility. The defense team, led by George Parnham, immediately files notice that they will utilize the insanity defense. Under Texas law, the insanity defense requires proving that the defendant, due to mental illness, did not know that their actions were wrong at the time of the crime. The prosecution will have to prove that despite her obvious mental illness, Andrea knew that drowning her children was wrong. The case will hinge on a crucial question. Can someone who is severely mentally ill and acting on psychotic delusions still be held criminally responsible for their actions? Before the case can proceed to trial, Andrea must be determined competent to stand trial. This means she must be able to understand the charges against her and assist in her defense. Given her severe psychotic state, this becomes a significant legal hurdle. Dr. Melissa Ferguson, the psychiatrist who evaluates Andrea at the Harris County Jail, will later testify that, in all the patients I've treated for major depression with psychotic features, she is one of the sickest I've ever seen. What happened next would shock everyone involved in the case, including the prosecutors who thought they had an ironclad murder conviction and a legal system unprepared for the intersection of severe mental illness and capital murder charges. The Andrea Yates case would unfold not as one trial, but as two separate legal proceedings that would span 5 years and fundamentally change how America views the intersection of mental illness and criminal justice. What follows is a tale of two verdicts, and how a single false statement by an expert witness would give Andrea Yates a second chance at justice. Andrea Yates was arrested immediately after her confession on June 20, 2001, and charged with capital murder in the deaths of Noah, John, and Mary. Prosecutors deliberately held back charges in the deaths of Paul and Luke, preserving the option to retry her if the first trial didn't result in conviction. Harris County District Attorney Chuck Rosenthal announced that the state would seek the death penalty. This was significant. Harris County, Texas, accounts for more executions than any other county in America, and Texas leads the nation in executions. If convicted of capital murder, Andrea faced either life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, or death by lethal injection. Andrea's family hired George Parnham as her defense attorney. When Parnham first met his client, she was rocking mutely back and forth in her jail cell, having picked her scalp raw looking for a sign of the beast. The first thing she eventually said to him was, "When can I go to death row?" The prosecution's strategy was straightforward. Focus on Andrea's actions rather than her mental state. Under Texas law, the insanity defense requires proving that the defendant, due to mental illness, did not know that their actions were wrong at the time of the crime. Prosecutor Kaylin Williford repeatedly used the word choice in her arguments, claiming that Yates had made specific choices and knew what she was doing. She told the jury, "To find her not guilty by reason of insanity is to say that we no longer have self-accountability in our society." The prosecution pointed to evidence that Andrea knew her actions were wrong. She waited until Rusty left for work. She called 911 immediately after. She confessed readily to police, and she asked about when her trial would be. They argued that these actions demonstrated consciousness of guilt. The prosecution's key expert witness was Dr. Park Dietz, a forensic psychiatrist and consultant to the television show Law and Order. Dr. Dietz testified that Andrea was not psychotic when she drowned her children, and that she knew her actions were wrong. But Dietz made a crucial claim that would later unravel the entire conviction. He testified that shortly before the murders, an episode of Law and Order had aired featuring a woman who drowned her children and was acquitted by reason of insanity after claiming postpartum depression. He suggested that Andrea had watched this episode and saw it as a way out. The prosecution seized on this theory, arguing in closing arguments, "She gets very depressed and goes into Devereux, and at times she says these thoughts came to her during that month. These thoughts came to her, and she watches Law and Order regularly. She sees this program. There's a way out." Defense attorney George Parnham told the jury, "If this woman doesn't meet the test of insanity in this state, then nobody does. 0. You might as well wipe it from the books. She was so psychotic on June 20th that she absolutely thought she was doing the right thing." The defense presented extensive psychiatric testimony showing Andrea's long history of mental illness, including her diagnosis of postpartum psychosis, schizophrenia, and major depression. Expert witnesses testified that Andrea believed deeply that killing her children was the right thing to do because she thought Satan had taken over her body and was targeting her children's souls next. On March 12, 2002, after deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury found Andrea Yates guilty of capital murder. The speed of the deliberation shocked many observers, given the complexity of the mental health evidence. 3 days later, on March 15, 2002, the same jury sentenced Andrea to life in prison, rejecting the prosecution's request for the death penalty. When the verdict was read, Andrea did not understand what it meant and asked her attorneys to explain it to her. Andrea's brother, Patrick Kennedy, spoke on behalf of the family. "We do not, as a family, believe that justice was accomplished here, because we believe a sick person has been sent to prison for 40 years. The conviction seemed final until journalist Suzanne O'Malley, who was covering the trial for the Oprah magazine, the New York Times magazine, and NBC News, made a startling discovery. O'Malley had previously been a writer for Law and Order and immediately knew that the episode Dr. Dietz described had never existed. After the conviction, O'Malley contacted the producers of Law and Order, who confirmed that no such episode had ever been made. On March 14, 2002, after Andrea was convicted but before sentencing, Dr. Dietz informed the Harris County District Attorney's Office that he had given incorrect testimony. The false testimony created solid grounds for appeal. Andrea's attorneys argued that the jury might have been influenced by Dr. Dietz's erroneous testimony, which had provided a motive for the murders and suggested premeditation. On January 6, 2005, a Texas Court of Appeals unanimously reversed Andrea's conviction and ordered a new trial. The appellate court held that the jury might have been influenced by Dr. Dietz's false testimony, making a new trial necessary. The retrial began on June 26, 2006, under significantly different circumstances. Since the first jury had already rejected the death penalty, prosecutors could not seek execution again. This meant the jury didn't have to be death qualified, composed only of people willing to impose a death sentence. Studies show that death-qualified juries are more likely to convict and favor the prosecution's case. Additionally, public opinion had shifted dramatically. The 4 years between trials had seen extensive discussion about postpartum depression, mental illness, and criminal responsibility. The general view in the media was that an injustice had been done in the first trial. The prosecution presented virtually the same evidence as the first trial, minus Dr. Dietz's false testimony about Law and Order. Dr. Dietz testified again, reiterating his contention that Yates knew her actions were wrong because Satan, not God, was the impetus for her actions. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Michael Wellner testified for the prosecution that Yates carried out an efficient and well-planned murder. The prosecution theorized that Yates drowned her children to escape the overwhelming stress of raising and homeschooling them. The defense again presented extensive psychiatric testimony. Dr. Philip Resnick, a leading forensic psychiatrist, testified that Yates believed deeply that killing her children was the right thing to do. During deliberations, jurors viewed a videotaped evaluation where Yates explained that she believed her children would grow up to be criminals because she had ruined them, and that killing them would save them from hell. On July 26, 2006, after deliberating for 13 hours over 3 days, the jury of 6 men and 6 women found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. It was very clear to us all that she did have psychosis, before, during, and after. Jury foreman Todd Frank said, "When the verdict was read, Andrea stared blankly at the jury, but later hugged her attorneys and smiled slightly. Her ex-husband Rusty Yates cried and nodded his head. He and his mother, Dora Yates, wept together and held hands. Andrea's mother, Karen Kennedy, cried in the front row. Outside court, Rusty Yates told reporters, 'It's a miracle.' Rather than freedom, the not guilty verdict meant that Andrea would be committed to a state mental hospital for treatment. The jury foreman explained, 'She needs help. Although she's being treated, I think she's worse than she was before. I think she'll probably need treatment for the rest of her life.' Andrea was initially committed to the maximum security North Texas State Hospital Vernon campus. In January 2007, she was transferred to Kerrville State Hospital, a low-security mental facility in Kerrville, Texas, where she remains today. Kerrville State Hospital sits on a hill overlooking the Guadalupe River. Unlike a prison, it has no fences and no guards, but patients are required to stay within designated boundaries. Andrea spends her days reading, sewing aprons, and creating cards for the hospital's gift shop. She makes crafts that are sold anonymously to benefit charity and watches videos of her children. Her attorney, George Parnham, visits her regularly and says, "Talking to her is like talking to my daughter. She's always asking questions about my ski trips and family vacations." He ensures that flowers are placed on her children's graves and tells Andrea about his visits to the cemetery, which delights her. Every year, Andrea's case comes up for review to determine if she's eligible for release. However, according to reports, she consistently declines her right to be reviewed each year, choosing to continue treatment rather than seek release. Her attorneys say it is highly unlikely she will ever be released, and her case remains under court supervision. There are no further appeals. The case is legally closed. Andrea was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a mental health facility, which was the outcome her defense team had sought from the beginning. Rusty Yates, who had stood by Andrea throughout both trials, filed for divorce in July 2004. The divorce was finalized in March 2005. Andrea received $7,000 in cash, the right to be buried near their children, a nursing chair, and part of Rusty's retirement benefits from NASA. In March 2006, Rusty remarried Laura Arnold at the Clear Lake Church of Christ and later had a son with her. Despite the divorce, Rusty has continued to advocate for Andrea and for research into postpartum psychosis. But for her sickness, she would never, ever have harmed our children, he has said. The case sparked a national conversation about postpartum depression and mental health. In 2002, the Yates Children Memorial Fund was established in honor of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary to raise awareness of postpartum depression and psychosis. The Parnhams were behind what became the Andrea Yates Law, which the Texas legislature passed in 2003. It requires hospitals and medical professionals to inform patients about postpartum illnesses. there continue to be efforts to make postpartum screening mandatory. The 5 Yates children are buried together at Forest Park East Cemetery in Webster, Texas. Their final resting place is marked by an ornate monument featuring etchings of their faces. George Parnham ensures that flowers are regularly placed on their graves and that the grass is properly maintained. Dr. Lucy Puryear, who testified in the case about postpartum depression, notes the lasting impact. It's pretty rare now that I run into OB colleagues, in particular, who don't know about postpartum depression and are not in some way aware of it. Before the Yates case, prospective parents could leave an obstetrician's office without ever hearing about the condition. The case highlighted the inadequacies in the American healthcare system's treatment of severe mental illness, particularly the role of insurance limitations in cutting short necessary psychiatric treatment. The Andrea Yates case ultimately became, as her defense attorney George Parnham described it, a watershed event in the treatment of mental illness in the criminal justice system. It demonstrated that even in Texas, with one of the strictest insanity standards in the nation, a jury could recognize that severe mental illness can rob someone of their ability to distinguish right from wrong. The case remains a powerful reminder of the devastating consequences when mental illness goes untreated, and the importance of early intervention, proper medication, and adequate support systems for struggling families. Andrea Yates sits today in a mental health facility, forever changed by the tragedy she caused, living with the daily knowledge of what she did to the 5 children she loved more than life itself. It's a story without winners, only the hope that from such profound tragedy, society might learn to better protect both the mentally ill and those they might harm. As we close this deeply troubling chapter in American criminal justice history, the Andrea Yates case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about mental illness, our healthcare system, and the very nature of justice itself. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere. Andrea had attempted suicide twice, had been hospitalized multiple times for psychiatric care, had previously filled the bathtub with plans to drown the children, and was explicitly told never to be left alone with them. Yet on June 20, 2001, she was left alone for exactly the window of time she needed to carry out her plan. The real failure wasn't in the investigation, but in the system that allowed this tragedy to occur. Multiple healthcare providers, insurance companies, and family members had opportunities to prevent this outcome. The case highlights how our society struggles to balance individual autonomy with public safety when severe mental illness is involved. Could this have been prevented if Andrea had remained on Haldol? What if insurance companies didn't limit psychiatric hospitalizations? What if religious extremism hadn't been allowed to influence her already fragile mental state? These questions will forever haunt everyone involved. The Andrea Yates case brought national attention to a phenomenon that was poorly understood: mothers killing their children during episodes of postpartum psychosis. Since then, we've seen similar cases that follow disturbingly similar patterns: mental illness, inadequate treatment, religious delusions, and family systems that fail to protect vulnerable members. This case reminds us that mental illness is a medical condition, not a moral failing. When someone is suffering from postpartum psychosis or schizophrenia, they're not making rational choices. They're operating from a reality that exists only in their diseased mind. Andrea Yates genuinely believed she was saving her children's souls by killing them. That doesn't excuse the tragedy, but it helps us understand it. We must also recognize that families dealing with severe mental illness need support, not judgment. Rusty Yates made decisions that seem incomprehensible to us now, but he was dealing with a situation for which he had no training or adequate guidance. The stigma surrounding mental illness often prevents families from seeking the help they desperately need. This case teaches us to take postpartum depression and psychosis seriously, to advocate for adequate mental health care, and to recognize that sometimes the people who most need our help are the ones whose actions seem most unforgivable. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary Yates are remembered not as statistics or case studies, but as the vibrant, innocent children they were. Their father, Russell, remembers them with love and continues to honor their memory. These children died not because their mother was evil, but because a system designed to protect them failed at every level. They deserve to be remembered as the beloved children they were, not just as victims of an unspeakable crime. What do you think about this case? Do you believe justice was ultimately served with the not guilty by reason of insanity verdict? Should Andrea Yates ever be released from the mental health facility? How can we better protect families dealing with severe mental illness? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. This case raises difficult questions about mental health, criminal responsibility, and the adequacy of our healthcare and legal systems. Your perspective matters in these ongoing conversations. If you or someone you know is struggling with postpartum depression or thoughts of harming themselves or others, please reach out for help immediately from your doctor and people responsible for your well-being. If you found this case as complex and heartbreaking as I did, please give this video a thumbs up. Cases like Andrea Yates force us to examine difficult questions about mental illness, justice, and how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society. Subscribe for more true crime content every day, where we dive deep into cases that shaped our understanding of criminal justice, mental health, and human behavior. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a case, because understanding these stories helps us build a more just and compassionate society. Next week, we'll be covering another case that changed how America views mental illness in the courtroom. The story of a crime that shocked a community and challenged everything they thought they knew about the people living among them. Until then, stay safe out there, and remember, if someone you know is struggling with mental health issues, don't wait for a crisis to seek help. Early intervention can save lives and prevent tragedies like the one that befell the Yates family on that terrible morning in June 2001.